At 57, Rakim has nothing left to prove. He's the god MC, the blueprint for lyricists, the man who shifted the very DNA of hip-hop. But now, at 57, he's doing something few expected, pulling back the curtain on hip-hop's darkest side. After a lifetime of battles with labels, producers, and power players, Rakim is finally naming the 5 most evil people in the industry, the ones who turned his journey into a constant war for control. At number 5, we start with Eric B. The partnership between Rakim and Eric B wasn't just another hip-hop duo. It was the kind of collaboration that changed the DNA of rap itself. Back in 1985, Eric Barrier, a DJ from Queens, was searching for the perfect MC. A promoter pointed him toward a teenage lyricist from Wyandanch named William Griffin, who the world would later know as Rakim. The two clicked instantly, and what followed was nothing short of historic. Between 1987 and 1992, they dropped 4 albums that reshaped the culture: Paid in Full, Follow the Leader, Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em, and Don't Sweat the Technique. These weren't just records, they were blueprints for a new level of lyricism and production. From the very beginning, Rakim believed their business was set up fairly. He's often explained that everything was split right down the middle, 50-50. It was an arrangement that made sense in those early years, when both men were hungry and focused on proving themselves. But what started as a strong foundation eventually became the root of a bitter fallout. As their contract with MCA Records neared its end in 1992, the label wanted to move them into the next phase: solo projects for each artist. For Rakim, this felt like the natural next step. He'd already proven himself as an MC, and a solo album was a chance to fully express his own vision. For Eric B, though, this shift wasn't an opportunity. It was a threat. What came next wasn't an explosive public feud, but a slow, suffocating legal war. According to Rakim, the problems began when Eric B refused to sign MCA's release contract. Rakim says his partner feared that once he went solo, he would leave Eric B behind. That refusal created a legal roadblock, and before long, Rakim found himself stuck in a contract he couldn't escape. At the peak of his career, one of the greatest lyricists of all time was trapped in silence. For 5 long years, Rakim couldn't release new music, and those lost years became one of the greatest what-ifs in hip-hop history. Eric B, however, has always told the story differently. He frames their split less as betrayal and more as the natural end of a long partnership. To him, it wasn't about contracts or sabotage, but about 2 men who had simply grown apart. He often compared it to a family needing a break from each other. Whenever accusations of bad business came up, Eric B always leaned on the same defense: their 50-50 deal. "How can I do bad business when we split everything equally?" he would say. It was a powerful statement, one that reminded fans of the fairness of their financial arrangement. But digging deeper, it becomes clear that this argument was only half the story. Yes, the money was split fairly in the past, but Rakim's frustration was never about old earnings. It was about being blocked from moving forward. By constantly redirecting the conversation back to the fairness of the 50-50 deal, Eric B shifted public attention away from the real issue: his alleged refusal to sign the release that would have freed Rakim to build a solo career. Both things could be true at the same time. Eric B may have split money fairly, and yet also stood in the way of Rakim's independence. This was more than just a legal fight. It was a battle over the narrative. Eric B defended his reputation by pointing to the numbers, while Rakim sat in silence, his career on hold, his legend growing in absence. What should have been his prime years as a solo artist were instead spent in limbo. For Rakim, this wasn't just a business dispute. It was the kind of betrayal that comes from someone who once stood at your side while you built history together. Next on the list is Big Daddy Kane. Even as Rakim was wrestling with the silent war inside his own camp, hip-hop outside was heating up. The late 80s and early 90s were a battleground for lyrical supremacy, and Rakim wasn't walking alone at the top. 2 names stood across from him on that mountain: Big Daddy Kane, the smooth-talking wordsmith from Brooklyn, and EPMD, the Long Island duo who had carved out their own empire. These rivalries didn't unfold like his dispute with Eric B, where paperwork and contracts strangled his freedom. Out here, it was about reputation, skill, and who could truly claim the title of king. The tension with Big Daddy Kane was like a chess match being played in the shadows. In barbershops, street corners, and radio stations, the debate was constant. Was Rakim the greatest MC alive? Or had Kane stolen the crown? Every verse from either man was dissected for hidden shots, every song release became an event, and fans were convinced they were hearing subliminals aimed across borough line. Rakim himself later admitted Kane was the one MC who had him looking over his shoulder, and in his own words, he was young and cocky, constantly sizing up his rival with suspicion. The whispers grew louder when Kane dropped a track with the line, "I see leaders, and I just laugh." To casual listeners, it was just a lyric, but to the streets, it was a dagger pointed straight at Rakim's chest, mocking the legacy of "Follow the Leader." Rakim didn't take it lightly. In 1990, while recording "Let the Rhythm Hit M," he laced his verses with sharp, unmistakable darts aimed at Kane. It was shaping up to be a Cold War about to turn hot, but before the world ever got to hear the diss, the situation shifted. Ant Live, Eric B's brother and a key figure in Kane's circle, got hold of the track and immediately knew it would spark something bigger than just lyrical competition. He stepped in and put Kane directly on the phone with Rakim. What followed was the kind of conversation that rarely happens in hip-hop. Kane told Rakim straight up that there was no beef, no personal animosity, and that people were trying to stir the pot. For Rakim, hearing that man-to-man made all the difference, he respected the honesty, scrapped the diss, and the world never got the battle it had been waiting for. Instead of exploding into a headline feud, the rivalry simmered back into its natural state, two titans pushing each other to reach higher without letting it turn ugly. If Kane's situation was all about mutual respect, the issue with EPMD was born from pure misunderstanding. Rakim had dropped a line on his debut, "You can get a smack for that, I ain't no joke," which was just him staking his claim as a serious lyricist. Not long after, Eric Sermon and Parrish Smith released "You're a Customer," with Parrish spitting a line about a "dig 'em smack," a playful nod to the Sugar Smack cereal mascot. To Rakim, though, the timing and the phrasing felt a little too close for comfort. On the streets, fans were already stirring it up, insisting that EPMD were firing shots at the God MC. Rakim wasn't about to let it slide. On "Follow the Leader," he delivered one of his most pointed rebuttals. "Stop buggin'," a brother said, "dig 'em? I never dug 'em." It was a lyrical strike that left no doubt about who he was addressing, and Eric Sermon later admitted they couldn't match it. He even had to confess that Rakim's pen was too sharp, too heavy, and too untouchable for them to respond. But once again, things didn't spiral into an all-out war. Instead, it came down to a face-to-face encounter at The Building, a buzzing Manhattan nightclub where hip-hop's elite often crossed paths. At the bar, Rakim and Parrish spoke directly, cleared the air, and ended the conflict before it became something larger. What these stories show is that Rakim wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was ready to defend his crown at any moment, and his words carried the kind of weight that could crush a rival's momentum in an instant. Yet, he wasn't reckless. When given the chance to handle things with respect, he always chose dialogue over destruction. With Kane, it was a phone call that kept the peace. With EPMD, it was a simple conversation at a club that ended the noise. These moments revealed something important about Rakim. He drew a sharp line between battles of skill and wars of betrayal. If the conflict was about rhymes, he could engage, escalate, or de-escalate depending on the respect shown. But when it came to business, contracts, or control of his future, those were wounds words alone could never heal. After patching things up with rivals like Kane and EPMD, Rakim found himself in a very different kind of conflict, one that had nothing to do with money or lyrical shots. This time, the sting came from silence. Out of all the clashes in his career, one of the most telling was with KRS-One, not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. And that is why KRS-One is on our list. In 1989, hip-hop was standing at a crossroad. Violence at concerts had begun to tarnish the culture, and the tragic death of a fan at a Boogie Down Productions and Public Enemy show forced the community to look in the mirror. Out of that moment came the Stop the Violence movement, a bold attempt to prove that hip-hop could rise above the chaos. KRS-One stepped up as the leader of this campaign, rallying the biggest stars of the era to record Self-Destruction, a charity single that would go down as one of the most important collaborations in rap history. Chuck D, Kool Moe Dee, Heavy D, MC Lyte, Doug E. Fresh, an entire lineup of heavyweights came together on one record to deliver a message that the world desperately needed to hear. The track became an anthem. Its profits went to the National Urban League, and its impact stretched far beyond the charts. But when the video dropped and the song took off, one name was noticeably absent: Rakim. The omission stood out like a missing piece of a puzzle. By this time, Rakim wasn't just another rapper. He was the God MC, the man who had redefined what lyricism and hip-hop could be. His rhymes carried a spiritual weight rooted in the teachings of the nation of gods and earths, and his presence on a record like Self-Destruction would have been powerful. Yet he wasn't called. Years later, Rakim would admit the slight didn't just roll off his shoulders. He felt it deeply. He remembered clearly that KRS never reached out, and that omission lingered in his mind like like unfinished business. Why was he left off? KRS-One never gave a full explanation, but over the years many have speculated. One theory is that Rakim's ties to Eric B and the circle of men who surrounded him made things complicated. The back cover of Paid in Full wasn't just a photo, it was a showcase of some of the most feared street figures in New York. Their reputation for violence was well known, and for a movement that was trying to denounce bloodshed in the community, inviting Rakim may have looked like a contradiction. Whether that was the reason or not, the decision sent a quiet message that perhaps Rakim, for all his brilliance, was too closely linked to the streets for a movement built on peace. For Rakim, the snub was personal, but it also underscored something bigger. He had always occupied a strange place in hip-hop. His lyrics made him a hero of the conscious rap tradition, yet his real-world affiliations kept him at arm's length from the very movements that defined that space. He was respected by every corner of the culture, but he never fully belonged to any one faction. Part of that came from his own reserved nature. He wasn't the kind of artist who chased the spotlight or played the industry games, and he admitted openly that he preferred to stay away from most of the politics behind the music. Still, moments like this showed that his isolation wasn't just a choice. Sometimes it was forced upon him. The self-destruction episode was more than just a missed phone call or a forgotten feature. It was a reminder that Rakim's path was always going to be different. While others built alliances, joined movements, or stood on stages together, he often walked alone. That solitude gave his music its power, but it also left him vulnerable to being excluded from moments that defined the culture. And for Rakim, watching from the sidelines while his peers united on one of the most important records of the era only deepened his sense that hip-hop was never a level playing field. Another artist Rakim once considered evil is Dr. Dre. When Rakim finally stepped back into the spotlight after years of legal limbo, his 1997 debut, The 18th Letter, was hailed as a return of the god MC. But as much as critics celebrated it, the record didn't spark the kind of sonic movement that Rakim had once been known for. His sound, though respected, felt like it was caught between eras. By the early 2000s, however, a fresh headline had the entire hip-hop world buzzing. Rakim was linking up with Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment. For fans, this wasn't just another record deal. This was hip-hop history in the making. The greatest lyricist alive was about to work with the producer who had just built empires around Eminem and 50 Cent. It was billed as a dream team. And to stoke the fire even more, Rakim delivered a sharp verse on Truth Hurt's hit single Addictive. That one appearance had people convinced the upcoming album would be nothing short of legendary. The title was even floating around, "Oh my God!" But instead of a masterpiece, the project crumbled. The sessions turned into a creative tug-of-war, with both men pulling in opposite directions. Dre was known for his precision and ability to craft records that not only sounded flawless but also ruled the chart. His formula at the time was built on gangsta rap, the style that had powered his success since the days of NWA. According to Rakim, Dre wanted him to lean into that approach fully. Studio sessions often ended with Dre urging him to get more aggressive, to talk tougher, to make records that sparked rivalries. It was a prescription designed for dominance, but it wasn't one Rakim could swallow. By then, Rakim was in his 30s, and the man who once revolutionized rhyme schemes wasn't interested in making music that dragged him backwards. He wasn't trying to chase controversy or posture as someone he wasn't. His focus was bigger, more universal. He spoke about wanting to create an album that crossed boundaries, one that children, elders, and hip-hop purists alike could play without hesitation. Conscious, thoughtful lyrics were his vision, not the confrontational storytelling that the industry was demanding. And the industry was part of the problem. While Dre respected Rakim's artistry, Aftermath was tied to Interscope Records, a label that was laser-focused on hits. People close to the situation later suggested that it wasn't Dre pushing hardest for gangsta content, but the label itself, which wanted a project with a perfect single that fit neatly into the image they believed would sell. That pressure put Dre in a corner and left Rakim standing firm on his side of the line. Eventually, Rakim made the call himself. He sat down with Dre, thanked him sincerely, and let him know it was over. In true Rakim fashion, he didn't make a dramatic exit with headlines and outbursts. He simply packed his bags, avoided the airport as he always had, and rode a bus all the way back to New York. He walked away from what could have been the most commercially successful move of his career, all because it didn't align with his vision of who he was as an artist. That decision wasn't just about one album. It fit into a pattern that stretched across his career. First with Eric B. B in the late 80s and early 90s. And later with Dre, Rakim kept finding himself at a crossroads with powerful partners who wanted to mold him into a formula that worked for them. And each time, he chose his own path, even if it meant losing out on bigger fame or more money. Behind his calm, understated presence was a stubborn strength that refused to bend. For Rakim, control over his music was everything. Better to be silent and true to himself than to become the voice of someone else's agenda. Number one on the list isn't one particular artist. In fact, Rakim believes that the entire hip-hop industry in itself is evil. The force that haunted his career from the very beginning was the music industry itself. Time and time again, Rakim wasn't just up against rivals in the booth. He was staring down a system designed to control, to trap, and to profit at his expense. That fight began almost immediately after he and Eric B signed their first major deal with MCA Records. What should have been a moment of triumph quickly turned into chaos. Two other labels, Zakia and Profile, stepped forward, claiming they already had binding agreements with the duo. Suddenly, Rakim's future wasn't about making music. It was about watching powerful companies fight over who owned him. To the world, he was a young genius changing rap forever. But behind the scenes, lawyers and executives treated him like property, a pawn in a bigger game where contracts mattered more than creativity. Glide Truth only got sharper when the partnership with Eric B unraveled. On the surface, it looked like a personal rift, but underneath it all was a legal nightmare that dragged Rakim down. Their contract with MCA gave Eric B the ability to hold on to Rakim like a lock on a door. Because Eric B refused to sign the release papers, Rakim was stuck. For 5 long years, he couldn't drop new music. Imagine one of the greatest MCs alive, silenced not by a lack of inspiration, not by a rival's diss, but by paperwork. The very deal that was supposed to elevate him had become a cage that froze his career at the height of his powers. Even his innovations carried hidden traps. The groundbreaking sound of Paid in Full relied on sampling, something that became a legal minefield. Funk legends like James Brown and Bobby Bird, whose voices and grooves had been cut into the tracks, came back through lawsuits. What hip-hop considered homage, the industry treated as infringement, and Rakim was caught in the middle of that storm. And years later, when it seemed like the Aftermath deal might finally restore his throne, the system struck again. The single that was supposed to relaunch him to the masses, Truth Hurts Addictive, became tangled in one of the most expensive copyright lawsuits in music history. Aftermath had used an Indian sample without clearing it, and the fallout reached $500 million. Instead of Rakim's long-awaited comeback being the story, headlines were filled with lawyers, injunctions, and a shadow of scandal that drowned out the music. Looking back, it's impossible not to see a pattern. His struggles with Eric B weren't just about ego. They were about a contract that turned friendship into leverage. His stalemate with Dre wasn't simply a clash of vision. It was Interscope breathing down Dre's neck for something safer, shinier, and more marketable. Even his very first steps in the business were clouded by competing labels trying to claim ownership over his name and voice. What this reveals is that Rakim's greatest battles weren't really against men. They were against the machine those men worked for. Again and again, the corporate side of hip-hop twisted his relationships and poisoned the art. The industry wanted control, formulas, and profit at all costs. And in the process, it turned Rakim's story into a constant war for freedom. By the time he reached his late 50s, the mask had come off completely. The people he now calls the most evil in hip-hop are not just rivals or critics. They are the power brokers and gatekeepers who use contracts, lawsuits, and money to clip his wings.